Okay, so by now you have this emerging sense, I hope, of what virtue is. So let's discuss in greater detail what the main framework for virtue is, or how the concept of virtue itself is structured. So first we have this basic idea, or this well-known idea from Aristotle, that virtue is a golden mean. So virtue is a condition intermediate between two states, one involving excess and the other deficiency. So he borrows the concept of a mean from mathematics, mean as an average, because he's talking about virtue, the excellent response, as being a middle ground or intermediate or in-between state. Now, this is a very interesting insight from Aristotle. Basically, he is saying that virtue, the good response, the right response, is not the opposite of the bad response. Instead, the good response is situated in between two bad responses, and there's more than one type of bad response. There's a bad response that goes in the way of excess, and there's another bad response going in the way of deficiency. So virtue is a golden mean. It is difficult to articulate in between state or in between range of responses. And Aristotle says in his classical text, the Nicomachean Ethics, that virtue is a golden mean, but not in the literal sense of a mathematical average, because it is a mean relative to us. So that's where the phrase comes from that I have reason to refer to before, which is that there's a context sensitivity to it. Let's try to understand what Aristotle means by that and how the Aristotelian framework operates. So we have here a short quotation from Martha Nussbaum from the Nussbaum's paper. She says, to give an account of the different virtues, begin by isolating a sphere of human experience that figures in more or less any human life, and in which more or less any human being will have to make some choices rather than others and act in some way rather than some other. There may be, and usually are, various competing specifications of what acting well comes to. Okay, so the generic or general concept of virtue is that it's a form of excellence that is an intermediate state. It's a golden mean between excess and deficiency. Now, from this generic definition, we now move to accounts of particular or specific virtues. And in this slide, I have the example again of courage, and then I have an example of courage. Of apt anger, sorry. So there's apt anger and courage. Those are the examples that we're looking at here. The first thing to notice is that we have two lines, from mathematics, that line is a collection of points going in two different directions. So it's two-dimensional. So we have arrows going in different directions. Now, before we understand what virtue is, I have to go back again to the idea of what virtue is made of, or what virtue is grounded in, or from where virtue arises. So the answer is virtue is made out of experience, right? What experience? Not just any experience, not just any random experience that you can name, right? But virtue arises from a sphere of human experience, so a certain domain of human life that virtually all human beings encounter, go through, and make decisions about. Nussbaum has a list in her paper that I'm asking you to read. So she has a list that comes originally from Aristotle, and then she comes up with her own list. So these are, in these lists, we have a generic or general account of things that humans just have to deal with. Right? So it's mga karanasan ng tao na hindi mo pwedeng iwasan, na kailangan mo pagdaanan, na kailangan magdesisyon ka kung dumating sa iyo yung mga karanasan ganon. Hindi mo pwedeng takasan yung karanasan na ganon kahit na magpanggap ka na hindi nangyayari, ito ang nangyari. Halimbawa, lahat ng tao natatakot. So fear is the raw material for virtue because fear is something that human beings go through and make decisions about. Now, let's talk about the blue line here. So the blue line is supposed to represent fear. Each point in this line represents a response to fear. So we have a range of responses to fear. On one end, on one extreme, we have excessive response to fear. Every time you become afraid, you stop doing something. Every time you experience fear, you just act on the fear, meaning if you're afraid of something, you run away from it, you stop doing it, and you go in the direction the fear is pushing you to, which is usually to hide or to run away or to freeze or just avoid risk, right? So we have a range of responses to fear, and one extreme is you pay attention to fear too much. You have such a high sensitivity to fear that you're almost a slave to it. Every time we experience fear, it's not up to us when we're going to be afraid. Every time you experience fear, you do the thing that fear seems to be pushing you to do, right? Now, on the other end is a deficient response. So lack of sensitivity to fear. So this kind of person barely experiences fear anymore in maybe the ordinary way that we refer to it. So the person who is deficient in fear almost always disregards what fear is indicating. Fear, by the way, is an indication of danger. It's an indication where when we're afraid of something, it's usually because whatever the event or person or whatever it is that's presented to us can damage us physically, can wound us, and can even kill us. So there are people who barely pay attention to that, and whenever there's something that's dangerous, whenever there's something that's scary, they go ahead and run towards the scary thing, towards the risk, towards a dangerous situation. So we have a collection of responses, and if we're trying to locate virtue, virtue is a difficult to reach point somewhere in the middle. It's not a mathematical average. Courage is right here, right? So it's in between two vicious or bad responses. So one response is cowardice. This is probably more common than the other kind. So excessive fearfulness is cowardice. Recklessness is deficiency in fear, not paying attention even when fear is indicating something important, something is very dangerous. And it seems that the risk is not worth it because the payoff is not very high or something like that. So courage is a golden mean. By definition, virtue is in between cowardice and recklessness. It's further away from cowardice and probably a little bit closer to recklessness. So when we need to give an account of a specific virtue, and your group work is going to be about this, you need to work together to give a description and an explanation of what an individual virtue is. Now, one of the most challenging parts is identifying the sphere of human experience. That's a chief challenge. Once you have identified the sphere of human experience, then you can begin to use this framework. The framework is basically the line that gives you a sense of excess here and deficiency here. And virtue is, by definition, an excellent middle ground response. The courageous person is a person who pays attention to fear in the right measure, at the right time, in the right manner. She may experience fear, but still proceed with a certain course of action because she judges that's important. And she has this set of strategies to deal with the emotional or physical side of the experience of fear. And she's able to move towards happiness because she manages fear in this way. So courage is a collection of middle ground responses. There is no single specification of courage. I was saying in the previous recording that a courageous student in an organization and a courageous soldier will have different things, but probably we have a range of excellent responses somewhere here in the middle. So that's what we're all aiming for. So the nice thing about this framework is that it gives you the whole spectrum of responses, so from this end to this end, and that it helps you. It's actually easier to identify the extremes. It's easier. And then from there, you move towards the middle. Now, one dimension of the idea that virtue is a mean relative to us is each individual person, in trying to acquire a virtue and trying to be courageous, for instance, the beginning is a bit of self-awareness, and we try to recognize and we try to reflect so we can recognize where we are on this spectrum. So one concrete question you can ask yourself when you're trying to build courage is, to what extreme am I more inclined? Am I inclined to be here on cowardice, excessive fear, or am I inclined to this one, recklessness, right? Notice that a person who is right here, closer to cowardice, will be doing very different things to get to the middle, compared to the person who is more inclined to recklessness. Maybe this person is likes thrills, thrilling experiences. That usually comes with going towards fear, right? So the person who is inclined towards recklessness will be doing very, very different things to get to excellence. So we can have two or more people who are located on different aspects of the spectrum. And if you are talking about this framework, we can talk about a convergence towards an excellent middle ground. So different people will be doing very different things, even as they have a similar or overlapping target, the excellent middle ground response, and they are both working towards that balance so that they can attain happiness. So this is how the concept of virtue works, and you can kind of apply this line and this idea of virtue as a golden mean indefinitely, and even where we cannot have a single virtue word. So for many of the spheres of human experience, it has something to do with emotion. So here we have two emotions, anger and fear. Virtually all human beings experience fear. Virtually all human beings experience anger. And then when we experience anger, when we experience fear, we have to make a decision about what we're going to do now that we're angry, right? And we can talk about an excessive and deficient response to that experience. Now, Nussbaum says the brilliant thing about the Aristotelian framework is that we can use it to anchor our discussion, even if we don't have a single word for the virtue. So she says, because of the variety and dynamism of human experience, there are things that emerge that we have to deal with. And sometimes we don't yet have a very definite word in our language or in any language about what the virtue is about. But we can use this golden mean idea together with this diagram to anchor our discussion so that we're talking about the same thing, right? So Nussbaum says this is a generative and interesting framework, and we can use it to determine what to do, what kind of person should I be? How should I go about this? I want to have a certain trait. I want to have a certain character. I want to be courageous. How do I go about it? Well, one way is to understand what virtue is and then to use this in the way that I have just described. Okay, so far so good. Now, at this point, because of the context sensitivity and the willingness of virtue ethics, I'm sure you've noticed this, the willingness of virtue ethics to entertain more than one possible specification for virtue. There are various forms of courage. There are various forms of generosity, right? Virtue ethics has a problem with moral relativism. So I have here an old issue of Time magazine. I used to use it many years ago. I think this came out in 2010 or something like that. It's a lot more relevant now that Afghanistan is again controlled by the Taliban, right? So I have a story connected to this picture. This is a woman. Her name is Aisha, and she was rescued by people about 10, 12 years ago. She was in an abusive situation. Her husband and her in-laws, her mother-in-law and father-in-law, are beating her up, and they are starving her, and she was having a really hard time. One time she was beaten up. She almost died, so she ran away. Now, for the Taliban, a woman running away is unacceptable. So she got caught and she got punished. And what you see here in the picture is the punishment. They cut off her nose, and they actually left her in the desert in the middle of the night to die. It's just that people found her and rescued her, thankfully, right? So virtue seems to have a special problem with relativism more than other perspectives like consequentialism, because it seems to be tolerant, right? So we'll go back to the problem presented by relativism again, this time using virtue concepts. So the first thing is that there are various cultures and moral perspectives in the world. There are different religious traditions, there are different languages, there are different cultures, there are different forms of life. And that's just a fact, right? I'm just describing how things are. And in those cultures, in those religious traditions, in those languages, there are various competing ideas about how to live, what kind of person to be, and what the right thing is, right? That's a problem with relativism, right? So it seems foolish to think that there's only one and only one reasonable or justified way of life, right? In fact, the idea that there is a single reasonable and justified way of life appears to be the source of imperialism, or this tendency of many cultures and peoples imposing themselves on others. And we know that from the history of colonialism. So tolerance seems like a good response to at least some differences of opinion, right? So live and let live. Acknowledge that your culture is not the only one, right? So on the one hand, we have the idea there are differences, and tolerance seems like a good idea. And yet we look at the picture of Aisha and we hear about the culture of the Taliban, which is a very extreme form of Islam. And we come to this other idea, which is that surely we cannot just uncritically accept the status quo in all cultures, right? So the idea is, why, on the one hand, tolerance seems like a good idea. On the other hand, tolerance cannot just mean we're okay with anything. Even something like this, treating a woman, a human being, like an object, like property. She ran away. It's unacceptable for her to run away because she's considered property of her husband and her husband's family. So she was punished like this. And actually, she was disposed of like an object that's no longer useful, right? So how do you practice tolerance without becoming completely unprincipled? So this is actually a kind of problem that we can use virtue concepts or virtue-based ideas to discuss. And it's kind of interesting here that I'm beginning to show that tolerance is not the same thing as anything goes. Tolerance is not the same thing as uncritical acceptance of anything, right? So some people look at virtue ethics and then compare it with other perspectives, like for utilitarianism, there's an answer to why this is wrong. There's an answer to what is wrong based on how much harm and suffering it produces, how unstable society becomes because of like all the discussion that we went through previously under utilitarianism about what happens when you oppress a minority. In this case, the minority group is women. And then you have certain consequences for welfare in society, right? So if you're a utilitarian, you may be able to say, okay, some forms of life may be acceptable, but when it produces this kind of massive suffering and it marginalizes minority, it diminishes the overall well-being that we can have. So we'll do something else. We'll reject that. But if we have an interesting spectrum of responses, like what we saw in the previous slide, virtue as a golden mean, you have that interesting line, and then the two extremes, one of excess, one of deficiency. It seems that that's not strong enough to rule out certain things like this, like what happened to Aisha. Now, there's some people who argue that virtue ethics has a more serious problem with moral relativism, and this is actually the problem that Martha Nussbaum directly engages with and directly addresses. So how does she do that? She argues for particularist objectivity. So this is an idea that Nussbaum directly takes from Aristotle and expands for the purpose of current discussion. She first notes that there are domains where there can be an objective answer, but it's not something clear or straightforward to get to that objective answer. So she says, we can have this method that we have in science where we see something, we observe something. The first thing that we should do is to name it, to name something, and then we investigate it further. People have been doing this since thousands of years ago when they saw thunder, when they heard thunder, when they saw lightning, they found a name for it, they concocted an explanation for it, and they tried to investigate it further. We still use this method today. So we see the emergence of a new virus, or a new variant of the virus, and we name it, and then we investigate it further. And Nussbaum says we can use the Aristotelian framework for engaging in this kind of inquiry. So if you remember the spectrum, the line for the golden mean, we can use that, and we can use our tools in psychology, in economics, in sociology, and associated disciplines, and we can try to figure out what kind of responses to fear, what kind of responses to difference of opinion is healthy, actually produces flourishing in communities and for individuals. So that is Nussbaum's proposal. Now, how does this address the relativism objection? Now we see this idea behind particularist objectivity. Aristotle is famous for this claim that particularism is compatible with objectivity. Now, a lot of people are concerned about whether there are absolute answers. Sometimes absolute is interpreted to mean there can only be an absolute answer if there is a one-size-fits-all answer, if there is a universal principle. Aristotle's perspective goes in a different direction by looking at domains or areas such as medicine and navigation. Navigation, especially in the times Aristotle lived. So this is closer to what you probably saw in the movie Moana, where she was being taught how to navigate using her hand and the stars and the wind and the temperature of the water and something like that. We'll not talk about navigation a lot, but we'll talk about medicine. There are various ways of looking at medicine or treating illness, whether in animals or in people. Sometimes, because of the way that the pharmaceutical industry has developed for many years, sometimes people are tempted to think that there is going to be like a single correct answer on how to cure a disease. But in medicine, there is actually a lot of specificity and a need to adapt to the specific patient or the specific living being that you're treating. So in medicine, especially now that we're looking at stem cell treatment that is indexed on specific individuals, the idea that there's a single way to treat or improve the health outcomes of someone or something is being challenged. So the idea, the right way to treat the patient is going to depend on the patient's condition, what the patient has. So there's an objective answer to what the disease is, or what the diseases are, because it's usually a combination. And there's a partially objective answer to how to treat it based on established standards of care or available resources. But exactly how the healthcare worker or the medical professional will manage treatment is tailored to a specific patient, especially if it's a challenging condition or set of conditions. So Aristotle says, in the same way that an objectively correct answer in medicine is particularist, specific to the conditions of a patient and location and what's available, we can have a similar paradigm or a similar model for ethics. This actually works for things like diet also. So if we are looking for an excellent middle ground answer to the right amount of food you're supposed to take, there's an objective answer to that, but it will depend on not on a one-size-fits-all approach where you just determine your gender or your age or how much you weigh, and then you're given a certain amount of food. That will not work. It will have to look at more specific things like the rate of your metabolism, what you're about to do, your physical conditioning, the state of your muscles, and so on. So Aristotle uses a very different paradigm for objectivity, is Nussbaum's answer. And Nussbaum also says it isn't necessarily a bad thing to have more than one acceptable answer to an ethical problem. So Nussbaum introduces this idea that the Aristotelian framework gives us a different paradigm of objectivity, the paradigm of objectivity that you get in medicine, especially in as much as we are trying to aim to produce health or excellent health outcomes for people who have a set of illnesses that are special combination, or maybe we're talking about athletes who need a special kind of diet so that they can attain a certain level of performance. There are objective answers to how to treat a certain patient with a set of interesting conditions, in the same way that there is an objective answer for the correct diet or set of training for someone like Heidi Diaz or Mesty Petesio, but it's indexed on the individual. Nevertheless, the answer is objective, right? And why is that? Because the target, the equilibrium target, which is health in the case of medicine, and a good life, happiness in the sense of ethics, it's something that's results oriented, right? It's something that you can actually see in the outcome. So Nussbaum says, in ethics, we have a range of acceptable answers. And that's not a bad thing. She even argues that it is a good thing to have a range of acceptable answers in ethics instead of having a single one-size-fits-all response. So this is like saying ethics works by establishing what is out of bounds. So you can think about that. This is one metaphor I heard from another philosopher Brian Van Norden, who talks about ethics being a kind of thing that gives you something like a bowling alley. So that the gutter, so you end up in the gutter, you don't hit targets, right? So, but anywhere in between the gutter, you can slide the ball and you can still have a chance at your target, which is hitting all the pins or hitting as many of the pins as possible. So this is a very interesting perspective in ethics where the project is to rule out certain things that are out of bounds because that will not produce happiness, and then to allow individuals and communities to choose and navigate what kind of approach they will take upon themselves in the middle ground. So in the range of acceptable answers, which are they going to take and why? And they can have an interesting discussion and set of exercises in decision making and figuring that out, right? So that's Nussbaum's reply to the objection from relativism. And she presents this very different perspective on ethics. There's a version of that objection that's based on the ideas of Michel Foucault. I will leave it to you to read about Michel Foucault as discussed by Nussbaum in her paper. In this slide, I have a picture of Aisha. This is a picture of her, I think about 1 or 2 years after she was rescued. So they did reconstructive surgery so that her sinuses are not exposed after her nose was cut off, and she appears to be healthier in this picture. So Foucault has this objection saying that universal grounding experiences are an illusion. You know, they're not really objective because whenever we look at experience, we always already look at experience from the lens of our socialization, of our culture, of our religious tradition, and so on. And Nussbaum gives this answer where she says, well, yes, Foucault says that, but it's true. So she makes a concession. There's no such thing as an innocent eye. We're always already determined by where we're coming from, culturally speaking. But she says Foucault's argument is meant to be therapeutic and not destructive, which means that Foucault is trying to draw attention to the way our perspective is influenced by culture, not to tell us that we are completely trapped in culture, a la moral isolationism, but that we can loosen the grip of culture in our minds. That's what Foucault is trying to do, according to Nussbaum, that he draws attention to the way that perception is colored by culture, not so that we can just break down and say we're completely determined by culture, but precisely so that we can break out of it and we can entertain new possibilities and to begin to imagine and to build new forms of life. Nussbaum also says that we must not overstate the amount of attunement, recognition, and overlap across different cultures. That it's true that there are substantial differences, but also it's true that there are significant overlaps. And in determining the range of acceptable answers that is indexed on humanity itself, what allows a human being to flourish, right? We can say that as a basis for what to rule out, we must move toward greater inclusion and increased understanding of peoples. And actually, in the case of Aisha, we can have a very significant agreement on the appropriateness of rescuing her and helping her to rebuild her life, both from the perspectives of Islam and Christianity and even atheism, right? The judgment that it was wrong to treat Aisha the way that her husband, her in-laws did, is shared by Christians, many Muslims, because many Muslims reject, and for good reason, the Taliban version of the religion, and even people who don't have any religious beliefs at all. So we can have greater inclusion and increased understanding of people if we pay attention to the amount of attunement, recognition, and overlap across different cultures. So that's it for this recording. And we have discussed the relativism objection to virtue. And before we did that, we also discussed the concept of virtue itself.